This is the story of Ruth, chapter 4. Boaz told everyone in town that he wanted to take care of Ruth. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. Everyone celebrated the wedding day. What a feast they had! Naomi was so happy about Ruth's new husband, and she knew that they would keep taking care of her too. Naomi and Ruth thanked and praised God. God was blessing them with a new family. Before long, a little baby was born. Ruth and Boaz named him Obed. Ruth, Boaz, little Obed, and Grandma Naomi spent many happy years together loving each other and loving God. A long time later, baby Obed grew up, and he also had a son. His name was Jesse, and then Jesse had a son named David. David became king. And then, a long time later, one of David's descendants had a baby. And this baby was Jesus. God greatly blessed Ruth. She was a very great grandma to the Savior of the whole world. The end.
Today we are wrapping up our series, A Christmas Story, which has been a 4-week series on the life of Ruth. And if you've been with us, possibly you've been wondering, great story, Jason, but why is it called A Christmas Story? What does this have to do with Christmas? Today is your day because you are going to find out. If you haven't been with us during the series, I'm going to catch you up to speed, but instead of rehashing the entire story, I'm going to show you guys a 7-minute video that was made by our friends over at BibleProject.com. And the reason why is because this video not only summarizes the story of Ruth, but it illustrates the brilliance and the genius of the literature of Ruth. You're going to like it. Let's take a look.
The Book of Ruth. It's a brilliant work of theological art, and it invites us to reflect on the question of how God is involved in the day-to-day joys and hardships of our lives. There are 3 main characters in the book: Naomi, the widow, Ruth, the Moabite, and Boaz, the Israelite farmer. And their story is told in 4 chapters that are beautifully designed. Let's just dive in and see how this all unfolds. Chapter 1 opens with this line, "In the days when the judges ruled." And it reminds us of the very dark and difficult days from the book of Judges. And here we meet an Israelite family in Bethlehem, struggling to survive through a famine. And so in search of food, they move on to the land of Moab, Israel's ancient enemy. And there the father of the family dies, and the sons marry 2 Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. And then the sons, they die too. And so they leave only Naomi and these new daughters-in-law. And so Naomi, she has no reason to stay anymore. And so she tells her new daughters-in-law that she's moving back home. And Naomi, she knows that the life of an unmarried foreign widow in Israel is going to be very hard. And so she compels the women to stay behind. Orpah agrees, but Ruth does not. She shows remarkable loyalty to Naomi, and she says, "Wherever you go, I'm going to go. Your people will become my people, and your God will become my God." And so the 2 of them return to Israel together. And the chapter concludes with Naomi changing her name to Mara, which means bitter in Hebrew, and she laments her tragic fate. Chapter 2 begins with Naomi and Ruth discussing where they're going to find food. And it just so happens to be the beginning of the barley harvest. And so Ruth goes out to look for food, and it just so happens that she ends up picking grain in the field of a man named Boaz, who just so happens to be Naomi's relative. We're told that Boaz is a man of noble character, and he notices Ruth. And so after finding out more about her story, he shows remarkable generosity to her. He makes these special provisions so that the immigrant Ruth can gather grain in his field. And in doing so, Boaz is actually obeying an explicit command of the Torah to show generosity to the immigrant and the poor. Boaz is so impressed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi. He prays for her that God will reward her for her boldness. So Ruth comes home that day, and Naomi finds out that she met Boaz, and she is thrilled. She says Boaz is their family redeemer. Now, This family redeemer thing, this was a cultural practice in Israel where if a man in the family died and he left behind a wife or children or land, it was the family redeemer's responsibility to marry that widow, to take up the land and protect that family. So Naomi, she begins to hope that perhaps there might still be a future for her family. Chapter 3 begins with Naomi and Ruth making a plan to get Boaz to notice their situation. So Ruth is going to stop wearing clothes of a grieving widow, and she's going to show signs that she's available to be married. And so Ruth goes to meet Boaz on the farm that night. And as she approaches, Boaz wakes up and he's totally startled. And Ruth makes her intentions very clear. She asks if Boaz will redeem Naomi's family and marry her. Boaz is once again amazed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi and her family, and he calls Ruth a woman of noble character. It's the same term used to describe the woman of Proverbs 31. So Boaz tells Ruth to wait until the next day, and he will redeem both Ruth and Naomi legally before the town elders. And so the chapter ends with Ruth returning to Naomi, and they marvel together at all of these recent events. In chapter 4, it all comes together. It turns out, at the last minute, Boaz discovers there is a family member who's closer to Naomi than he is, and he's actually eligible before him to redeem the family. But at the last second, this family member finds out that he's going to have to marry Ruth, the Moabite, and so he declines. But Boaz, remember, he knows Ruth's true character, and so he acquires the family property of Naomi, and he marries Ruth. And so just at the beginning, how Ruth was loyal to Naomi's family, so now Boaz is loyal to Naomi's family as well. The story concludes with a reversal of all of the tragedies from chapter 1. So the death of the husband and the sons is reversed as Ruth is married again and gives birth to a new son, granting joy to Naomi. And this symmetry between the opening and the closing, it's even more remarkable. So remember, the opening tragedy was followed by a great act of loyalty on the part of Ruth. And that is now matched by Boaz's act of loyalty that leads to the family's final restoration. And this symmetry, it highlights the design of the internal chapters as well. So each of the chapters begins with Naomi and Ruth making a plan for their future, and that's followed by a providential meeting between Ruth and Boaz, and each chapter concludes with Naomi and Ruth rejoicing at what's taken place. This story is beautifully designed, and that design actually connects with a really interesting feature of the story, and that's how little God is mentioned. Right? The characters talk about God a few times, but the narrator actually never once mentions God doing anything directly in the story, and that's its brilliance. Because God's providence is at work behind every scene of this story, weaving together the circumstances and choices of all these characters. So Naomi, her tragedy leads her to think that God is punishing her, but actually the whole story is about God's mission to restore her and her family. And he's doing so through Ruth, through her boldness and loyalty, which brings healing to Naomi's life, but not without Boaz, who's a no-nonsense farmer who's full of generosity and loyalty. And so God uses his integrity combined with Ruth's boldness to save Naomi and her family. And so this story brilliantly explores the interplay of God's purposes and will with human decision and will. God weaves together the faithful obedience of his people to bring about his redemptive purposes in the world. And that leads to the real end of the story. The book of Ruth concludes with a genealogy, showing how Boaz and Ruth's son, Oved, was the grandfather of King David, from whom came the lineage of the Messiah. And so all of a sudden, these seemingly mundane, ordinary events in this story are woven into God's grand story of redemption for the whole world. And so the book of Ruth invites us to consider how God might be at work in the very ordinary, mundane details of our lives as well. And that's what the book of Ruth is all about.
Is not the book of Ruth simply incredible? By the way, if that video was helpful for you, You can find that video and dozens like it at BibleProject.com. They do an outstanding job of helping the Bible and its context come alive to modern 21st century American readers. So great resource there to check out. Well, today we pick up in chapter 4, and when we left off at chapter 3, we saw that Ruth didn't technically propose to Boaz. She proposed that he proposed to her, like right now. Boaz says, Ruth, I would love to marry you, but there is one obstacle that stands between us getting married. There is a man who is a kinsman redeemer of Elimelech's family, and he has the right to marry you before I do. Don't worry, we'll get into all this in just a second. But Boaz says, Ruth, you go home to your mother-in-law Naomi. I'm going to go take care of this right now. I'm going to go take care of this today. So he sends her home, and as soon as the sun comes up, he goes to town to resolve the problem, move the barrier so he can marry Ruth. We are in Ruth chapter 4, verse 1. Meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town gate and sat down there, just as the guardian redeemer he had mentioned came along. Now, every clan in Israel would have one or several guardian redeemers, and they had several roles. You can read about them in Leviticus 25 and Deuteronomy 25. Basically, their job was to make sure that the integrity of every family was kept intact if they were going through hardship or catastrophe. Now, one of those roles a guardian redeemer would take would be this. If a man in a family was married but then died before he had an heir, a guardian redeemer had the right to redeem the land and to marry the man's widow if he was eligible for marriage, and then the first son they would have together would receive that inheritance from the deceased. That way, in the Mosaic Code, it helped prevent intergenerational poverty, to be honest. It kept family lines and boundaries in place, and they'd be passed on from generation to generation. The whole Mosaic system economically was set up to make sure there wouldn't be intergenerational poverty. Now, Boaz was a guardian redeemer, a kinsman redeemer, but this guy was also a guardian redeemer, and he was closer related to Elimelech, Naomi's dead husband, than Boaz was. So Boaz said, Ruth, there's this one guy who stands between us. He's first in line, I'm second in line. So Boaz goes to town, and I love how the author says, just as the guardian redeemer he had mentioned came along. Wouldn't you know it? What a coincidence. We see God's providence again at work in this story. Boaz said, come over here, my friend, and sit down. Now, I love that Boaz never addresses him by name. He just calls him my friend. And the narrator never tells us the name either. I'm sure they both knew his name, but he's going to remain nameless. And sometimes when biblical authors do that, the reason why is because they're showing that this is a historical figure. It's probably best to just forget. We don't want to embarrass him. So he, Mr. What's-His-Name, we'll call him, Mr. What's-His-Name went over and sat down. Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, sit here. And they did so. So what he's doing is he is saying, I'm about to conduct a legal transaction, and I need the town elders to be witnesses of what is about to transpire. Verse 3. Then he said to the guardian redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of those seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. To which we say, Boaz, dude, what are you doing? Why are you telling him to buy it? You're supposed to buy it and you're supposed to marry Ruth. I think that if Naomi had been here, she would have said, my name is no longer Mara, which means bitter. My name is now livid. Boaz, what are you doing? But trust Boaz. He has a plan. Boaz says, if you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line. So Boaz is conducting everything in a proper and legal format. And Mr. What's-His-Name responds, I will redeem it, he said. This seems like a no-brainer deal for Mr. What's-His-Name. It's almost impossible to buy new land in ancient Israel. Along comes an opportunity for him to buy land. It means it comes with a bitter old woman in Naomi. But hey, he can put up with one bitter old woman. No big deal. He'll provide for her. He'll make sure she's taken care of. But now he gets all this property, and he has a bigger estate to pass on to his inheritance. It's an offer he can't refuse. And then Boaz shows him the fine print in verse 5. Then Boaz said, "On the day you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property." So he says, it doesn't just come with a bitter old mother-in-law. It also comes with a Moabite widow who really wants to make babies. That's the fine print. And by the way, when you make a baby with her, your offspring will be half Jewish, half Moabite, and then that son, he's going to actually inherit the land. The rest of your kids won't. Suddenly not such a sweet offer to Mr. What's-His-Name. At this, the guardian redeemer said, "Then I cannot redeem it because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it." Now, this next part, it's kind of quirky, but I love it. Now, in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. So the guardian redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it yourself," and he removed his sandal. So instead of signing contracts, what you would do is you would hand over your sandal. So that way, if someone came along and challenged Boaz later, "Hey, you didn't have the right to buy this. Mr. What's-His-Name had the right." Boaz just goes to his filing cabinet, pulls out a sandal. "Oh, this Mr. What's-His-Name? I stand corrected. I see you have a sandal." And he looked like he was walking with a limp. I guess he was just missing a sandal. That was their system for signing contracts. So Mr. What's-His-Name hands over the sandal, which is the legal way of saying, "I turn over and relinquish all rights to purchase this property, and you are legally next in line. Here's my sandal." That's him signing the contract. Verse 9, now Boaz's plan has come to completion. Then Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, "Today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown. Today you are witnesses." Then the elders and all the people at the gate said, "We are witnesses." And now look at how they bless Boaz and Ruth. "May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel." Now, Rachel and Leah were matriarchs of the entire nation of Israel, and for them to bless Boaz and Ruth in this way said, "We think you are worthy of a great honor. May the Lord richly bless your family." They continue, "May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah." Tamar was the matriarch of the clan of Judah, and the people of Bethlehem were all members of the tribe of Judah, and they are honoring Boaz and Ruth. They're saying, "You are people of character, you are noble people. Yes, she's a foreigner, yes, she's a Moabite, but she has come to live among our people, and we ask the Lord to bless you richly." Now, this has already been a pretty big day for Boaz and Ruth. Let's recap the events of the day. Under the cover of night, Ruth snuck into the threshing floor. She uncovered Boaz's feet. She proposed. He proposes. He says, "I will. Let me go take care of business." He goes to town, gets a major legal property transfer taken care of, and it's still only about 10 a.m. Now, here's what comes next. This is a big day. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The literature is just fascinating. Think of all the buildup it took to get to this one verse. Chapter 1 was 10 years of pain, 10 years of grief, 10 years of heartache. And then chapter 2, all of a sudden, it takes an entire chapter just to talk about one day of Ruth working in a field. And then it takes all of chapter 3 just to explain one night on the threshing floor. And then it takes all of chapter 4 to get this legal transaction done. And then in the course of one verse, they get married and they have a baby. And just like that, the two problems that Naomi and Ruth experienced at the beginning of the story, they had no food and they had no family, were resolved at the end of the story. And it's interesting here because the narrator says that the Lord enabled her to conceive. Now, God is completely silent in this book, but the narrator does let us know there are two times when the Lord provides. The first time was at the end of chapter 1. The Lord provided a barley harvest, and the people had food. And now the Lord provides the ability for Ruth to conceive, and she has a baby. The two things they needed were the two things that the Lord provided in His providence. Here's what that means for us. Whatever we are going through, we can trust that the Lord is good, and in His good and proper time, the Lord will provide. Now, at this moment, Ruth and Boaz fade into the background of the story, and the camera pans, and it focuses our attention again on the same character we saw at the beginning of the story, Naomi. Because ultimately, as we've been saying through the series, the book of Ruth is the story of Naomi, and it follows the redemptive arc of her story. It follows the story of how Naomi went from bitterness to joy, how Naomi went from death, because remember, the book started with 3 funerals, to life, as it ends with wedding and a birth. It's the story of how Naomi went from despair to hope in the future again. It's the story of how she went from emptiness, as she said, the Lord has made me empty, to fulfillment. And here's what happens at the very end. The women said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer." What's interesting is they're not talking about Boaz. They're talking about the baby we see as they go along. "May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." Then Naomi took her in her arms and cared for him. This is just a beautiful picture. In ancient times, the perfect family was typified by a husband and wife coming together and having 7 sons. 7 was the number of completion. 7 was the number of perfection. And the women come and they say, "Ruth has been better to you than even a perfect family could have been to you." And we read the ending and we see that Naomi has been redeemed and her heart has been filled with joy and with hope and with life. That's a good story. That's a satisfying ending to the story. And if we were watching this in the movie theater, this is the point when the screen would go dark and the soundtrack would turn up a little bit and the credits would begin to roll, and you're sitting there in your chair just in amazement at the beauty of this story, and you'd maybe quick wipe the tears from your eye before the lights come on and everyone sees you crying. And then after you compose yourself, you finally gather up your things and you stand up to get ready to leave the theater, when all of a sudden the credits pause and the characters come back on screen, and you're delighted. It's a mid-credit scene. I'm convinced the author of Ruth invented mid-credit scenes because we have one right here. And you're wondering to yourself, is this going to be a mid-credit scene like a Pixar film where it's just something for fun and it brings delight? Or is this something like a Marvel movie where it's giving a foreshadow or a sneak preview of what's going to come in the future? What kind of mid-credit scene is this? Verse 17, here's the mid-credit scene. "The women living there said, 'Naomi has a son, and they named him Obed.'" Obed means servant or servant of God. "And they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David." Whoa, what? This is the story of King David? This is the story of the most famous, the best, the most powerful, the most benevolent king in the history of the nation of Israel. You're telling me that Ruth, it was his great-grandmother? That's amazing. This whole story was about what God was doing to bring King David into the world through this Moabite woman, this widow, through Boaz and Ruth. That's just amazing. And then the credits start to roll again, and you're left there in the dark theater wondering, if God did all of that just to line up the events of human history for King David to come into the world, I wonder what he's doing in my life. I wonder what he's doing with the events of my life and what that might be leading to. And you kind of wonder about that as you stand up and now you make your way out of the theater, and then as the last credits roll, there's a post-credit scene. Let's take a look. Now, the post-credit scene, it is a genealogy, and those get kind of boring for us, so I've got something for you to do. I want you to count the number of generations I read in the post-credit scene of Ruth. You ready to count? This, then, is the family line of Perez. Perez was the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, Boaz the father of Obed, Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David. How many generations were there? 10. The reason why we see 10 generations pass in the post-credit scene brings us back to think about how the story opened in chapter 1. It opened with 10 years of pain, 10 years of sorrow, 10 years of grief. And suddenly we realize that God allowed Naomi to experience these 10 years of pain, not just to be part of how her life would be redeemed. He allowed her to go through this because it was part of what God was doing in 10 generations of history. He was using this 10 years of Naomi's life as part of what He was doing in 10 generations of His goodness and His providence and His loving kindness, not just so that Naomi would be redeemed, but so that the people of the Israelite nation would be redeemed through King David. And then the lights come on in the theater. And you're going home with your mind just blown by God's wisdom and His providence and His eternal nature. And then a few days later, you hear something. You hear that they're making a sequel to the movie. The problem is, it's going to take a really long time to make this sequel. About a millennium. But there is a sequel to the book of Ruth. It's called the book of Matthew. Matthew is one of the 4 authors who wrote a biographical account of the life of Jesus that were included in the New Testament, and his is the first one. It's positioned first, and Matthew was originally writing to a Hebrew audience, an audience that grew up reading the Old Testament, an audience that grew up reading the story of Ruth, and that audience knew the story of Ruth, but Matthew was connecting some dots for them that they weren't even aware of. Here's how Matthew opens. He opens with the genealogy where the book of Ruth closes, and I'm not going to read all of it, but I will read the verses that have to do with our story of Ruth. Matthew chapter 1, verse 5. He's in the middle of the genealogy, and he says, Salmon, the father of Boaz, that's our guy Boaz, but look at what Matthew includes here, a new detail that wasn't in the book of Ruth, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz's father was Salmon. His mother was Rahab. Rahab? The Canaanite prostitute from Joshua chapter 2. The Canaanite prostitute who sought refuge among the Lord's people. And they took this woman who was an outsider. She was not an Israelite. She was Canaanite. She was not virtuous. She was a prostitute. And God's people welcomed her in until one day she met a man who was kind to her named Salmon. And he treated her with dignity and with respect and with loving kindness. And eventually Salmon and Rahab got married and they had a little boy, and his name was Boaz. That was Boaz's mom. Do you think that had something to do with the reason why he treated Ruth the Moabite with such kindness? With such tenderness? The reason why he welcomed in this outsider and made her feel like home? Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth, she's mentioned here in Matthew. Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of King David. Now that's where the book of Ruth ended, but Matthew says, and that's exactly where I'm picking up the story. He continues with the genealogy as he's going forward in history, and we're going to skip to verse 16, where it says, and Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, and Mary was the mother of Jesus. If only the Old Testament audience could have known where this story of Ruth ended. It did not end with King David. It ended with King Jesus. And the reason why is because Matthew's showing us that the story of Ruth is not ultimately about the story of the redemption of Naomi and her redemption from bitterness to joy, from death to life, from despair to hope, from emptiness to fulfillment. He's connecting the dots to show how this is a tiny story which points to the bigger story of your redemption. Your redemption from bitterness to joy, because joy is found in salvation, and that is in Jesus. It is the story of your redemption from death to life, because we were dead in our transgressions and sins, but it is by grace you have been saved through faith in Jesus. And it is the story how you have been redeemed from death to hope as we look forward to what is to come in God's kingdom. And it is the story of how you have been redeemed from emptiness and the empty way of life in the world to fulfillment in God's kingdom. This is the story of a redeemer. Now, to be a redeemer, we saw in the book of Ruth that a man had to check 3 boxes in order to be a redeemer. He had to have the right to redeem, he had to have the resources to redeem, and he had to have the resolve to redeem. Mr. What's-His-Name had the right to redeem Naomi and Ruth. He had the resources to redeem Naomi and Ruth, but he did not have the resolve to redeem them. It would cost him too much. Enter Boaz. Boaz, he had to do some work, but he gained the right to redeem Naomi and Ruth. He had the resources to redeem them, and he had the resolve to redeem them, and that's why Boaz is a redeemer, but Boaz is there to point us to our true Redeemer. Let's apply the questions to Jesus, our Redeemer. Does Jesus have the right to redeem you? Yes. He had to do some work, but at Christmas, that's what he did. He became one of us. He became our near relative. He took on flesh and blood and lived among us so that he could have the right to redeem you. Does Jesus have the resources to redeem you? Yes, he does. Through his perfect, sinless life, he lived vicariously in your place. On your behalf, he has the resources to redeem you. And does Jesus have the resolve to redeem you? Yes. Look to the cross. Look to his outstretched arms where he gave his blood. In order to redeem you, he gave everything to be your Redeemer. And that's why we see that the story of Ruth is not ultimately the story of redemption through a baby born in Bethlehem named Obed. The story of Ruth is ultimately the story of redemption through a baby born in Bethlehem named Jesus. That's the story of redemption to which the story of Ruth points us. And that means that in every season of life, we can trust God because he is not only a God of providence, he is a God who redeems. His path through our lives is not always straight for us. It is not always easy for us, but it is a path that inevitably leads to our joy and our redemption. And I think of this when I think of all the families in our church this year who've gone through so much pain, so many challenging situations, wondering why they have to walk this road. And what we learn in the story of Ruth is that God's path to joy may take time, but it is guaranteed. It may take time, but God will lead us there. And it may not even happen in the context of this lifetime, but that's kind of the point. This world is not the end of our story, because the story of your life, the story of my life, is part of a much larger story of what God is doing, not just for 10 generations, not just for 100 generations, but for 1,000 generations. And all of it is leading to our redemption and the redemption of this broken world. And that's what made Job in the Old Testament in chapter 19 say, I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end He will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been destroyed, yet I will see Him with my own eyes, I and not another. How my heart yearns within me. You can trust your Redeemer. You can trust your Redeemer in the bad times, because the best times are yet to come. And that's what makes the book of Ruth a Christmas story. Because it's the story of God's redemption. Now, if this story has sparked any joy in you, here's what I'm asking you to do. Spark that joy in someone else's life. This week we're going to celebrate Christmas. We're going to celebrate the birth of our Redeemer, where He gained the right to redeem us. And that is a message of great joy, and that is not just for us. That's good news of great joy for all the people. And this year, for Christmas in Lake Country, I am suddenly so excited, where I was initially so dejected knowing that we would not be in person for Christmas in Lake Country. I have come 180 to see this as the greatest opportunity our church has ever been handed to impact more people with the good news of our Redeemer at Christmas than any other time in our history as a church, because it's never been easier to go to church on Christmas. Invite people to Christmas services. I had someone at Hope tell me a couple weeks ago, you know, Jason, I might find a different church to go to with my family where I can be in person. Great, go. But not everyone you know is going to go to in-person church this year. Send the invite, send the link, call them up, say, would you like to come to Christmas in Lake Country this year? It's going to be entirely online, and we're designing the entire experience to be something that is best experienced in your living room, by your fireplace, and we're going to bring Christmas into your home, invite people, and make a difference. Because here's what I wonder, and I hope you wonder this too. When the lights go dark at the end of your life, what's your post-credit scene going to look like? What's that story that's going to live on even after your life is over? What difference did it make? I wonder, when I look at our church, if hundreds and hundreds of people come together and say, we are not living for the pleasures of this life, we are living for the glory of our Redeemer and the mission He gave us during our short lives to share the love and goodness of our Redeemer Jesus. I wonder what the post-credit scene could look like for Hope Church, because we're living in it in real time right now. There's going to be a time when it goes dark, and then the post-credit scene is going to come up. What story is that going to tell? Because do you know what God wants to do? He wants to take the ordinary events of life and do extraordinary things with Him. just like he did in the story of Ruth and Naomi and Boaz. God will take the ordinary events of your life and do extraordinary things with them. Will you partner with him to make that kind of difference? Let's pray. Father, first we thank you for this incredible piece of literature that we have in the Old Testament. We thank you that the words of this book were so carefully preserved for all these years so that we can read them and celebrate your goodness today, and help us to see that the story of Ruth, that's not just her story, that's our story, because it's the story of what you do in every generation. I ask that you will, this Christmas season, give all of us, especially those of us listening who've gone through so much pain this year, and give us a hope and a confidence that comes from your redemption. And that we will be a people that spread your love to an entire generation, so that more and more may look at you and call you Redeemer. Be with us and give us joy as we celebrate Christmas this year. In Jesus' name, amen.